It is my genuine belief that what we saw happen in Arizona State University over the past week is simply a symptom of low-grade multicultural thinking that has perverted the minds of people. And I will tell you why in a moment. But my friends, as I always say, if you enjoy this content, if you enjoy my messages, please be sure to subscribe, like, share, and comment on these videos. It helps me a lot. Now let's get into my message. My friends, I'm sure my entrance probably alarmed some of you, but I'll address what I mean by multiculturalism in a moment. But just for those who are unacquainted and unbaptized in the news of the past week or so as of the date of this video, there were two students sitting in a multicultural center at Arizona State University, a place built to apparently reflect the principles of multiculturalism, which simply means differences in cultures being around each other and maintain their identities in that space, in that area. They were harassed by two students of color, if you want to use that word, two black students, who took issue with the slogans they bared on their laptops. One student was bearing a slogan that said "Police Lives Matter," and that slogan was taken to be a statement of violence and aggression, since apparently saying "Police Lives Matter" is a repudiation of everything the Multicultural Center at Arizona State University stands for. At least it has been cast as a repudiation by one of the students who were chastising the two students who were just sitting there doing their work. Now, as I mentioned before, there was absolutely no actual physical violence going on the students' part. There was no actual verbal scuffles going on the students' part until they were verbally assaulted. They were simply sitting down, doing their work, and their presence and their slogans were deemed as a threat. Here were some of the things said by the two students who were assailing them with their words. They said, "Multiculturalism means we provide a space that protects the most marginalized," which is not exactly what multiculturalism means, but that's what it's been taken to mean. They also said two conservative men, two white students, were threatening black students by saying "Police Lives Matter," because apparently that is a repudiation to Black Lives Matter. And they have also said that all of those things constitute a sense of violence. Now, the Twitter space has been buzzing about this. Jordan Peterson has put out a tweet that said that this is the fault of universities for indoctrinating their kids in this mindset. Someone who I respect very much and who I've had on this channel, Jonathan Church, who is a brilliant scholar, but I think he's a little bit wrong on this issue. He has said that he thinks that on one hand, it was condemnable for the students to go ahead and attack the white students. But on the other hand, why would the students go into a multicultural center, which is based upon a certain ideology, and bearing slogans that go against that ideology? Isn't that provocation? Excuse me. Well, my friends, we got to analyze a few ideas here. Number one, the idea of violence. What is this idea of violence? Number two, the idea of multiculturalism. I think understanding both these ideas at their root will help us understand exactly what's going on here in the minds of these two ideologically possessed students that are harassing these conservative students. So, my friends, violence, at least as it relates to left-wing understandings of violence, is not simply a physical phenomenon. So if I were to punch you in the face, most people will be able to identify that readily as an act of violence. But violence is also a sort of psychic phenomenon. It can happen mentally, or it can happen through words. It can happen through means that are not traditionally understood as violence. And the criteria to deciding what a non-physical force of violence is simply how the person who is receiving the content of the alleged violent act receives it. So if I say something to a black person that's considered to be a microaggression, like, for example, if I say something to a black woman about her hair, your hair looks good, where do you get your hair care products from? Someone can take that as a microaggression, assume that is violence, and then say, there is violence against me. In fact, there's a critical race theorist called Mary Matsuda, who defined violence of the word in her language as the following. She said, in addition to physical violence, this is a direct quote, there is also violence of the word. Racist hate messages, threats, slurs, epithets, and disparagement all hit the gut of those in the target group. The spoken messages of hatred and inferiority is conveyed on the street, in the schoolyards, in popular culture, and in the propaganda of hate widely distributed in this country. And she eventually goes on to say that there can also be violence in ways that are exclusive or in ways that attack concepts that are known to people to apparently be true. For example, to say that reverse racism or reverse discrimination is bad is violent because it rejects the fact in her mind that only people of color, only folks who are marginalized can experience violence. So from this idea, the two students in that video take their mere presence to be violent, because these guys were not saying anything, at least as far as the video footage can show, and I'll have the video footage in the description down below. They weren't saying anything, but their mere presence and the slogans on their computers in a space that apparently is against all that is violent simply because it makes them feel a certain way. And their sentiments proceed from a premise of emotion, because we can easily see, as they have said in the video, they being the black students who were assailing the white students, they said, hey, do you understand how much labor we have put into this place? We being the people, apparently, who wanted it, the black folks. Hey, do you understand that this is the only place where you're not centered? Apparently, white folks are centered everywhere else in the multicultural place. Hey, do you understand this and that? Once again, my friends, these rabbit mentalities are reflective of the lie of subjective truth, which is bequeathed into the universities, which is bequeathed onto the students and infects their minds like a parasite and convinces them that things they don't agree with, that things that shake the very root of their sensibilities. And by the way, all of us need to be shaken in our intellectual foundations. Because if your intellectual foundations crash and fall when they're shaken, you gotta get rid of them. You gotta get rid of them. They're not worth it. They're not worth your time. You are a precious human being with the gift of reason bequeathed upon you by nature or God, I believe God personally, or how you want to handle it. And you should use that to the highest of your potential to enslave yourself to the ideas of subjective truth, of lived experience, at the expense of rationality. And that's what Matsuda says, at the expense of the classics, is to embrace a falsehood which cannot be shaken, because anything that shakes the falsehood is deemed as illegitimate by the falsehood. We have people in this country, people in our universities, deeming others illegitimate because their falsehoods are impervious to critique, because critique is an assault on their life. This is how the thinking goes. This is how the idea of erasure goes. This is how the idea that these critical theorists have bequeathed upon all of us go. What's erasure? Erasure is the idea that by doing certain things, you eliminate the existence of black people or anyone who's marginalized. Microaggressions go under this. And that idea was living within the mouths and the sentiments of the students in the ASU video. But we have to understand one thing, my friends. There's also an even bigger foundation here we have to analyze beyond the sort of subjectivity of changing the nature of violence to fit one's political presuppositions, which is just absolutely anti-intellectual and was on full display in that video and is in full display in Matsuda's work and the work of many other Western intellectuals who want to try to break down the foundations, the intellectual foundations of the West, break down our understanding of objective truth. Let's go beyond that. It's the idea of multiculturalism, which is the subject of this video. My friends, multiculturalism, and this is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, I'm paraphrasing, is a collection of ideas that simply at their core emphasize the retention of individual cultural identities within a confined space, within a country. And so multiculturalism says, hey, no, the melting pot theory of American society is absolutely false. We're not a melting pot. Cultures, all cultures that are outside the dominant culture are equal in their value, and they need to be maintain their identity lest they become subjugated and dominated by the dominant culture. So in a way, multiculturalism is actually a sort of a child of the sort of critical pedagogy understanding of what it means to be in a political society. What I mean by that is that multiculturalism is sort of has this dynamic of the dominant and the subjugated. And so what they posed in this dynamic is to liberate the subjugated, i.e. the culture that is not the dominant culture. So for example, if I was a Afghani, I come to American, the dominant culture for many people in America must be white or whatever, and the Afghani culture is subjugated. The multiculturalist wants to preserve the Afghani culture and raise it up and keep it up and value it at a higher level than the dominant culture. It basically makes all cultures that are not the dominant culture equal. Now, if you're going to go into a building, an institution that bears this pernicious idea as their genesis, you should at least, in my opinion, be ready to engage with an equal amount of intellectual force that idea has to dispute it, or to at least dispute those who may disrupt your time there. I do agree with that. I think Jonathan Dirks was right about that. But I don't think, however, that a group that prides itself on, an idea that prides itself on having a wide range of voices and ideas held up as equal is sensible to its own ethos when it subjugates an idea or a wide range of ideas that do not fit its paradigm. Isn't that exactly what the dominant culture does, multiculturalists? Isn't that exactly the critique of the... You guys aren't hearing me right now. Isn't the critique of the dominant culture is that it makes people assimilate, and therefore they lose their cultural identity, and therefore they are erased by these power structures, and therefore we must be multicultural to preserve that? Isn't that your critique? If that's your critique, then how does it make sense at all to subjugate the opinions of conservative students who weren't even saying anything but were bearing it on their computers, who were simply peacefully studying? How does it make any sense to go ahead and silence them and kick them out when you're supposed to be against the dominant narrative? Oh, here's why. Because when you have this idea of multiculturalism, the cultures that are outside the dominant narrative become the dominant narrative because they are exerting power and they're exerting control over the cultural space. This is why, in part, multiculturalism is bad. Because it simply is about shifting the power from the alleged power, by the way. I am very critical of this idea that there's a dominant culture. That makes no sense to me. But in their own framework, shifting the power from the dominant culture, bringing it down to non-dominant cultures, making them dominant, making them control the narrative, and then letting them set the terms. So it's reverse domination. It's an absurd, self-contradictory idea, yet it is praised because apparently if you're not multicultural, you're not accepting, you're not loving, you don't like other people, you're not nativist. Well, I am no nativist. I am someone who believes in the inherent equality of the human being. I believe that we are inherent in our equal in our value. I believe we all have rights that are dispensed upon us by God. I believe that we are all rational beings who contain multitudes. I am no nativist. And I also believe that America itself is enriched by a variety of cultures that come under its auspices. But I also believe that you must have a guiding set of principles that are indeed dominant, that are indeed held to be true, so social cohesion can happen and moral righteousness can happen. If you don't have in America that does not affirm individual freedom, that does not affirm personal autonomy, that does not affirm the primacy of human reason, you don't have a country that stands on morally righteous ground. I love all kind of cultures, but they must come under that umbrella. And if they cannot come under the umbrella of affirming human equality, of affirming reason, of affirming individual freedom, they have no place in America. Why do you think I could not go over to China and affirm the ideas of America, individual freedom, human equality, reason over there? Because that does not fit the goals of the Politburo. So if there were folks from China who wanted to export their version of communism into American political systems, I'm sorry, that's wrong. But most folks who have come here from China simply come here to work and have a better life, which is why you have the manifestation of little Chinas, of Chinatowns, of so many different people who just come here because they appreciate the universal values of the American system. So yes, I want other cultures to come to this country and understand its fruits and bear its fruits, but I do not and I will never want to have cultures that contradict what is morally true to come in here and try to change that. All because we want to be accepting. Well, guess what? To hell with acceptance. To hell with acceptance. Acceptance is not a universal value. Acceptance of what is good is a universal value. So when you have ideas like multiculturalism, which are not all about making sure everyone is equal or making sure that everyone is affirming their humanity, but all about making sure the power dynamics are shifted, we have a serious problem on our hands, my friends. I'm all for diversity. I'm all for intellectual diversity. I'm all for cultural diversity. I love it. I want more of it. I want more immigrants in America. I want more legal immigrants in America, 100%. But I don't want to have this sort of stratified, artificial concoction of power that destroys the ideas of this country, supplants them with all other ideas being equal, simply because that point of view thinks this country is built upon, as those ladies said in the video, genocide and slavery. There has to be a different way, and there's a different way. So my friends, we have to be very careful about this multiculturalism thing. There are plenty of writers such as Thomas Sowell and others who have written about it, and I encourage you to check out all of their articles. But as for Christian Watson and as for Christian Watson's house, I love intellectual diversity, I love cultural diversity, I love the fact that diversity is actually inherent to the human species, but I do not love it when power is used against dominant ideals, and that power automatically becomes dominant, and we do not understand ideals for their inherent value, but simply for what they're associated with. Police lives matter apparently does not matter anymore because the police is associated with death and destruction. And there are some officers who are indeed destructive and do indeed bring death, but there are plenty of more who do not. Nuance dies in these abstract ideologies. We have to keep nuance. We have to understand there are universal principles by which we can make good decisions, and we cannot allow that to die at the altar of lived experience and at the altar of broad acceptance, which does not take into account substance. Think on it. My friends, I love you. If you love me, patreon.com/officialcwatson, PayPal officialcwatson@gmail.com. You can get me on Locals, christianwatson.locals.com, or on Discord, which is in the comment section down below. Again, my apologies for the cold. Thank you guys so much for bearing with me throughout this video. I love you guys so much, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.